So good to see everybody, and thank you so much for joining our session. We're delighted about that. Just to give you a flavour of what we're going to talk about, we're going to start just by sharing with you, first of all, how Tim and I actually connected, because that's part of the story. Then Tim is going to talk us through how the work came about and how the book came about. Then we're going to zoom into one particular part of our resilience model. And then finally, we're going to think about how do you intervene on this issue systemically? Because that's been part of our learning, is that if you don't intervene at that level, then the impact is significantly reduced. And what we've also got, which we'll give you at the end, is a document that kind of summarizes some of our thinking around this, a diagnostic that you can use with teams that you're working with, and a summary of the model. So how did Tim and I meet? Well, Tim and I did a master's degree that started in 2002 in change agent skills and strategies. And it had the philosophy that unless you've got your own crap and your own pain and trauma sorted out, the risk is that when you do change work, it will inadvertently creep in and you'll make it about you. So we both thought we'd signed up for a master's. It turned out we'd signed up for 2 years of group therapy with a bit of change management chucked in. So we got to know each other pretty well. And afterwards, it seemed a real shame to waste that kind of deep level of trust and knowing. So ever since then, we've been co-coaching 2 or 3 times a quarter. And Tim, tell us how this work came about.
Yeah. Well, hello, everybody. It's so nice to see some familiar faces. Hello, Janet Jones. And everybody else. Nice
I haven't seen you for ages.
Yeah. So yeah, Matt and I have known each other about 20 years, and we've always had this co-coaching relationship. So anytime I've had a problem, guess who I've called? It's always been Matt. Anytime I've needed a dilemma or some really good input into how to handle something, Matt's always been there. And about 7 years ago, I had my own journey where I hit the wall quite majorly. And during that process of sort of co-coaching with Matt, an idea was born. And the book we've written is called Recharge, but I'm very curious. Beneath Recharge is basically practices that help us sort of get better quickly, as in we get our mojo back quickly. So this morning I was a bit nervous about presenting today, and I thought, right, okay, Sonos on, song on, within 3 seconds, I'm there feeling really fantastic. So I'm really curious in chat now, what are your go-to best get your mojo back practices? I'm just really curious, what are yours? Just to hear, because we always learn what people's go-to mojo, getting it back quickly practices are. If you can share in chat, that'd be great. Yeah, I've already got Pharrell Williams in my head there, Lucy. So yeah, straight away. 80s music, well done you. Wow, okay. Lots of movement in there. M people, lovely, Gordon. Yeah, walking outside in nature, excellent. Running, fantastic. So, you know, stroking the cat, absolutely. There's a blend of practices here, and here's what we do know about resilience: is that for it to be successful, and this is very much building on Neil's theme, is, you know, it needs to have a sort of an environment and a condition that's holistic. You can't just exercise well and expect to kind of be resilient. You can't just think well and expect to be resilient. You need this sort of holistic perspective. That's certainly our experience. And so, you know, behind the book was some thinking about, okay, how do we make this work? I'm going to share some screen now, and just curious to sort of share also with you some latest research, because while the world has got a bit more intense recently, there's been some research into kind of the last couple of years, the impact. And no surprise, you don't need us to tell you that things have got more serious when it comes to demands on us, certainly with hybrid, the blurring of boundaries. But McKinsey have published a fairly groundbreaking research document recently about, you know, what's our state here now? Where are we at when it comes to how we think about the future of work? And it found out, and it surveyed across 5 continents, so not just Western Europe, not just, you know, Eastern Asia, across all continents. What do we think? Where are we at, guys? And it found out that 49% of all their respondents, we're talking statistically significant here, were somewhat burnt out. That's it, somewhat burnt out. It's shocking. They also found out that actually of half those people felt acute anxiety because they felt their organizations, we're talking both private and public sector, they surveyed both sectors, are very anxious, acute anxiety, because there's no vision. Their organizations don't hold visions for the future. So this is only getting more fierce. And we know that when Goldman Sachs bankers are complaining about stuff, we know there's a problem, right? We know basically we can't ignore this. It's there and we have to do something about it. And here's the challenge is that, I don't know about you, but I kind of treat my phone sometimes better than myself. And what we do know, part of human nature is that, you know, we can quite often treat others, even objects, better than we treat ourselves. I mean, it's shocking. My phone, right, it's got protections on both sides, front and back. It's got the best warranty you could ever have. I'm paranoid about it getting wet, moist, anything. And I update it the whole time. I've got full insurance, and I'm going to change it in a year. In 1 year, I'm going to get a new phone, and I'm that worried about it. What do we do for ourselves when we're going to live on average 80 something plus years? How do we have a tool that allows us to kind of just stay well consistently, to sustain success, which is really, really important. So the idea behind the book was simple. We needed a dynamic process to help us navigate this. So here is our definition, which at its essence is all about being dynamic. Because while certain pressures are constant, life spikes. It bites you in the arse. You can suddenly just, something happens, whether it's a war, a divorce, a death, some bad news, that just completely spikes our demands. And we need to dial up our resilience, our recharge practices, and double down on the stuff we know that works really, really well. So the idea for me was born about 5 years, well, a little over 5.5 years ago when I hit the wall myself. And you know, I knew that actually in my peer coaching sessions with Matt being Matt, he's so rigorous. He's like, well, research stuff. Where do you need to start? My doctor, Audun Misha, is this pretty well-known Norwegian alternative medical practitioner. He's a bit of a guru here in Norway. And he was my doctor. And he said, look, Tim, start at the beginning. You've got to sleep better. I didn't know how to sleep. I'd never slept that well. He said, okay, you know, research how to sleep. And Matt being Matt, get the best research on how to sleep. So I started off just starting how to sleep better. And the idea of the book is really, let's research all the areas where we know it's going to help you. So what can you do, best practice, quickest, to get a recharge hit in the different areas you need it? So I took his advice, and Matt and I over those years were practicing out, trying all the different areas. And we started to come up with an idea we thought was pretty good. But I realized it hadn't been road tested properly, because as Neil was talking about, you know, what happens when things aren't going well? What happens when life really does punch you in the face? And it properly punched me in the face in 2018 when I was left as a single parent to a 5-year-old. My wife passed away through cancer. I didn't expect that. I hadn't planned on that. And I didn't think I had anything else to fall back on. I had to be a perfect parent, perfect mother and father. I'd never really been a good enough dad, I thought. And suddenly I had to think, what do I fall back on? And Matt being Matt, live the model, buddy, live the model. So I literally leaned back into the model, and it allowed me to realize, you know what, there's something in this. It helped me keep my sort of homeostasis, my balance through probably the worst time I can imagine. And I then knew we had something. So I said to Matt, right, we'll write this damn book. There's something in this. We're damn well doing this. So we got really serious in like 2019 and said, right, let's go. And of course, then what happens? Pandemic comes. And then good Matt being Matt is like, no, we're pushing through. So I'm pleased to say we finally got it over the line last year and got it out there. So what is the model? What is the approach? Well, a bit like life, it needs to be dynamic. We are not one thing. We're not a head with a separate body and a separate heart. We are a dynamic being. And what we've done is we've looked at, we need 3 types of batteries to be well, and they're all interconnected. We need a mental battery, a physical battery, and an emotional battery, and they're all interrelated. At its essence, the mental battery, how do you focus your energy? Because if you focus your energy well, your time will follow. You will feel better. So what's that quick hit to focus your energy well? How do you stay agile? How do you not get fixed into that mindset that just kills you because you're just attached to stuff? How do you get agile and develop a growth mindset? How do you also protect yourself with all the crap that's going on? How do you manage those boundaries? And Matt shortly will be looking at exactly how do you do that in a little bit more detail, just to take you through an example of how we work with people. Then the physical battery, where I had to start in the body. I had to start sleeping well, the basics. I then had to start also knowing what to eat. Everybody is different. Everybody needs to eat different stuff, right? But we do need systems and certainly routines to eat well, move well, and refuel ourselves well. So what are those go-to hacks? And finally, if you can't enjoy yourself, why bother? And what we realized actually is you can get really serious, but you've got to have a strategy to enjoy yourself. And if you enjoy yourself, life is just so much more energetic and fun. So we have a big part on how do you learn to enjoy yourself and learn those skills of enjoyment, because quite often we have to relearn them, particularly when we're burnt out. And on the right-hand side, the emotional side, I mean, of course, meaning is important. Without meaning, it's very hard to put the dots together. It's very hard to drive forward. But in particular, there's parts of meaning that really work. Gratitude is probably the quickest hit I know about changing my energy when it comes to having a bad day. As soon as I get grateful, gratitude just certainly writes me up again. So meaning has different elements. How do you develop that intuition as well? Of course, we need mood management, right? Who doesn't need mood management? But making it simple, accessible, quick, that's something we can learn. That's something we can do quickly. And that's important how to do. And then finally, connect. Of course, relationships are important. Connecting to others is important, but it's also important to connect to your pussycat, as you said in chat. Connect to nature. Have a strategy that allows us to connect to other, because we know if we rise above ourselves, we feel more energized. Now, that's probably the kind of the simplest summary I've ever done on the book, but its essence, it's all been researched, personally lived, personally tested by both Matt and myself, and now many clients. And we're very happy to share it to you today. So I'll stop sharing now and let Matt do a bit more of a deep dive in one of the areas.
Thanks, Tim. And Tim, just to say, as you were talking, different people were posting in chat different parts of the model that they were relating to, and it kind of resonated for them. It was interesting. I was doing a debrief of our resilience diagnostic with a head of comms for this global pharmaceutical, and it was during the pandemic. And it's interesting. He said, so, like, the joy's just gone out of my life. You know, the things I used to love doing, which is riding a powerful motorbike with mates and not eating anything green for about 3 days. He said, I've not been able to do that for nearly 2.5 years. And he was talking about how it was just making him miserable, because he realized how much he looked forward to that. So what we've done with the model, as Tim was talking about, is we kind of recognize that each of those elements that Tim talked you through has actually got a number of sub-elements. And so what I'm showing you here is the sub-elements from the mind piece. And what we find is the beauty of this is partly it recognizes the complexity of the topic. And that was something that we were at pains to kind of encompass in our thinking, that the fact that this has got so many dimensions to it. And whenever somebody tackles it simplistically, oh, let's introduce some mindfulness. I mean, in itself, it helps, but it's a very small piece of a much bigger, more complex puzzle. So every element has got 3 sub-elements. And what we found the beauty of that is, I mean, I was doing a session for a group of chief execs last year, and one of them came up to me at the end and said, I've been hearing so much talk about this, but what you've done with this approach is given me some really easy ways to actually start getting on road with this, and to actually start making some changes. And I'm really grateful for that. But one of the areas that I'd like to just sort of zoom in on and talk with you and get your reaction to is the whole issue of boundaries, because we see this as such a big issue with so many people that we work with. And just to give you some kind of data behind that, in the UK, we've got a health and safety executive that is kind of looking at health and safety at work. And in some research they published last year, they identified 6 issues which in their opinion caused the greatest stress for people at work. 3 of those were directly connected with how well people either set or enforce a boundary at work. So you kind of realize this, the ability to set and enforce boundaries is such a crucial issue when it comes to managing your energy, your stress levels, your well-being. And the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health talked about, again, a couple of years ago, the prolonged effect when you're in these situations where you're experiencing a lot of stress, and just how it affects our likelihood of and susceptibility to cardiovascular disease, musculoskeletal disorders, as well as psychological disorders. One of my own sons has had quite a serious mental health crash, and I would argue it's because of boundaries and the inability to kind of manage them, and that largely because of work. So let me show you a quote and ask you what you think. I mean, this is a very famous quote by Robert Frost: "Good fences make good neighbours." Either talk to me or type in chat. What do you think he means by that? What's he on about when he says good fences make good neighbours?
Matt, I think he's talking about having some kind of boundaries and not having spillover in all ways of your life.
Yeah. And why is that important, Susan, in your opinion?
I think because if you don't have some kind of boundaries, then it plays into what you were just talking about, but there's there's no clarity about each other's roles, about each other's responsibilities, about what's private, what's personal, what's shared, and people have different feelings and different thoughts on those things, and then everything's muddled. There's no clarity for anyone on that, and then it's hard to take back those boundaries without offending others.
Yeah, love that, Susan.
Matt, just to let you know, I moved into a new place only a year ago, and I have some lovely neighbours, and one particular neighbour was definitely trying to push the boundaries in terms of my space and my time. This quote is absolutely exactly what I've had to create.
Wow.
I mean, literally with neighbours, which is hilarious.
It's isn't it?
And it's interesting too, thinking about intentions. Sometimes people have different intentions behind pushing those boundaries, right? It could be, Paola, that maybe this person had other, whether it was romantic or friendship intentions that were different than your own, right? Because sometimes we don't know the intent, we just know the impact.
Yeah, it was about time. They wanted more of my. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you find, for me, the neighbours were a real godsend when I moved to this area. But actually, what they wanted of me was more of my company, and not romantically, but more of my friendship. But because they're reasonably lonely, and they wanted me to fill a gap. It was really hard because I like to please others, and so trying to create that fence was a struggle, actually, because I just felt I was letting them down.
Paola, thanks so much for sharing. Tan, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, it's kind of on Paola's anecdote. It's like she had her needs and her neighbours had their own needs, and they didn't have any bad intentions. They just didn't exactly know where the line was. And so the good fences make good neighbours is so key, because it's the good fence. It's like a good fence is probably tall and clear, and you can easily see where your space is and where someone else's space is.
It's interesting, Tan, you said that, because Kate said as well, the quality of the fence matters. Can your neighbours see it and feel it? I love that, Kate.
I've had experience of that myself, so yeah.
Okay. I tell you what's fascinating. I mean, I imagine a lot of you have heard of Linda Grattan. And I mean, she's done a huge amount of work on behalf of the future of work, works at London Business School. She published an article last year in MIT Sloan talking about hybrid working, and she said this. She said, what these intensive home-based ways of working are revealing with absolute clarity is something that psychologists have known for some time. Boundaries matter. Naomi, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it looks a lovely, neat fence, and it's a lovely boundary, but actually underneath that is probably the need to be able to have some really honest conversations. And I think with some of the other comments have been about, actually, and so I've got the name of the first lady that was talking about the boundaries with the neighbours, but that
Ella.
sort of, Ella, I'm very sorry,
Ella.
I can't see you on the screen, you've disappeared. But it's that sense of actually, you need to be able to feel confident to have that conversation, to put in the boundaries, and often the boundaries don't get put in because of fear of the conversation.
Yeah. We're going to talk about this in a minute, just some of the challenges that you've seen in setting a boundary, which is step one. But if you can't enforce it, then it's actually meaningless, which is why you may have seen within that section of the model, we also had courageous conversations. Because exactly as you're saying, Naomi, we've realized if you can't have a difficult conversation, or potentially difficult, then it's that boundary is meaningless. Janet.
Yeah, I was just thinking that this piece about hybrid working and boundaries mattering, it's like the boundary needs to be explicit, like the fence needs to be visible, and it needs to be clear that you are not going to invite people to climb over it or push through it. It's like, otherwise, if it's not in good repair, you're inviting invasion. And I do that all the time, not with real fences, but with boundaries. I realize I send these mixed messages because I want to be kind and I want to be inclusive. And I send out these messages that say, invade my boundaries. Here I am to serve you and serve the world and serve the greater good. And meanwhile, I'm kind of like not taking care of my phone,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, Janet, because one of the issues we find we often have to work with teams and people in organizations is what we call leaky boundaries, which you're describing. I say one thing, but then someone violates it, and actually I'm really pleased and I welcome it. The fact that they've emailed me or phoned me outside of my work hours that I actually have had a conversation with the team about. So they're like really confused. Rob.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this conversation and agreeing with many of those points. I think the other, not to stretch the analogy too far, but I think the bit that concerns me a little bit is, a fence is static and immovable. And I think that could be true of boundaries as well, in the sense that sometimes we leap to conclusions. We assess people, we judge, we figure out our world around us and other people's worlds around them, and then establish boundaries based on that interpretation. And often they're wrong. And also often they change. So actually at this point in my life, I need this certain boundary to help me be healthy and productive and whatnot. But actually at the next stage, which could be weeks, months, years away, I actually might need something different, or they might need something different. And so I think the reassessment is important, because if that fence just stays static and rigid, I think that could be a mistake for some of the time, I suppose, is the thought that's going through my mind.
Rob, I completely agree. I mean, boundaries are dynamic. They get renegotiated as needs change. I think a lot of people have renegotiated boundaries during the pandemic as they've realized that their needs have changed, particularly with often children being at home, being educated. But to what people have said, that often requires conversations to talk about the fact that things have changed, to check the impact of those changes on others, because there are some boundaries that we can set ourselves unilaterally. There are others that we need to talk to others about and agree. And we don't have it's disrespectful to set them unilaterally. So that conversation, that negotiation starts to become really important. This is our definition, by the way, of what we mean by a boundary from a book. It's simply a choice that you make, either how far you will go, how much alcohol I'm willing to drink, during the week, what time I go to bed. I heard a few people talking about bedtime boundaries in chat. You know, what's my boundary for stop using digital devices of a night? There are other boundaries where you need to agree that, and it may be, as Paula was talking about, how far you'll let other people go, like neighbours, how much of their time you're willing to let them have. And of course, what we know is if you don't make choices, then other people will make them for you. So one of the things that we found is, as a prerequisite for work, for teams doing work in this space, is actually accepting that they have the power to make some choices and the power and the right to initiate some conversations. And that, for a lot of people, is quite frightening, as a few people have already said. Akiko.
I find boundaries quite interesting because, I mean, I know that I have a lot of kind of anxiety sometimes creating the boundaries, and with the women that I work with, there's a lot of things around boundaries. But when I started thinking about boundaries as more like a rule where I don't have to decide every time where to draw the line, it's actually very freeing. So I've started to see boundaries as a kind of a gift to myself rather than, oh, what are they going to think? It just gives me a lot of peace. So instead of, making the decision every time it comes up, it's like a rule and it just frees space.
Yeah. And what jumps out at me is, as you just said that, Akiko, it's a bit like that fence. It just makes life a lot easier. You know, other people feel safe and aren't worrying, am I asking too much? Am I pushing too far? Rick.
Oh, you're making the point that I actually wanted to say, Matthew, but it's like, I remember years ago doing Tantra exercises with another person and how beautiful it was when we established those boundaries. It provided safety. If I know how far I can go, it means I can actually get closer to that person. I can move all the way into that boundary, knowing full well that that boundary's there and we're going to respect it. And so in many ways, it opens up deeper connection, a possibility between two people.
And it's interesting, Rick, I mean, Gordon's in chat said a very similar thing to you, just the importance of having those boundaries with your closest partner, and others are agreeing with that principle. So, I mean, question to ask yourself is, I mean, you've been sharing some of these already, but what are some of the challenges you've experienced that maybe you haven't mentioned already in setting and enforcing boundaries to create that safety and that health for you and others? I mean, for us, step one is actually helping people to accept that they have the power and the right to initiate those kind of conversations in teams and clients they work with. But what else have you seen as some of the challenges that need to be overcome to set healthy boundaries? Lucy.
Yeah, I gave up alcohol because for health reasons. I reckoned it was probably the final sort of piece for me. And it was okay during the pandemic because I didn't go out very much. But now it's really interesting because I'm starting to go out a bit more, and there are parties, and the norm is to drink. And, you know, for example, tomorrow it's my daughter's 21st birthday, and I'm thinking I'm going to have a glass of champagne, and that boundary is being leaked, but it's very specific for me that I'm going to have that, and it's about me choosing to do it. Where I start to sort of leak and get a bit wavery is when people go, oh, go on, Lucy, have a drink. You know, it's a bit boring. And then I start to question, oh, am I boring? You know, so it's just getting really clear why I'm doing this. And for me, and knowing that I'm not going to be perfect, you know, as human beings, we're messy. So it's okay to be messy, but sticking to your own, like Akiko was saying, really, your own boundaries and what you feel is right. But it's the social norms that I realize now that I'm seeing coming out of the pandemic. That's really hard. You know, because I'm quite sort of set with those. I realize I'm quite set with those social norms and what's right and what's wrong. And that's ridiculous.
Well, I think you've highlighted a really important point, which is people have got very different notions about what's reasonable. I was chatting to a friend of mine who's he's in his 50s and he's dating. and on the alcohol point, and he said he's had dates with people and he doesn't drink, and he's gone out on dates, and when he's told the person, I don't drink alcohol, he said literally some people have said, I'm really sorry, that's a deal breaker for me, and they've got up and left. I mean, in some ways, credit to them for being really honest and upfront about the boundary. And he's being really clear, saying this is my boundary, and it's like, okay, there's too big a gap, you know, there's no connection. But you're right, Lucy, people have very different notions about what's reasonable. I mean, I worked in KPMG, and for 5 years worked in the investment banking bit. They had totally different notions about what it's reasonable to expect of people than when I was in one of the central functions, and it was just much more normal working hours. By the way, I can see 4 people have got their hands up. I don't know if they're still up from when you spoke last time, or you still want to say something. So if Janet, do you still want to speak?
Yeah, in my case, it was an answer to your question. What are some of the challenges I've
Yeah,
faced?
go ahead.
And, you know, I wrote about it and said that, you know, I don't notice that someone's transgressed the boundary always until suddenly the transgressions are at such a level that it's a real pain in the ass for me. And then and only then do I realize it's like that they've taken a football pitch where I had offered an inch of compromise and I didn't notice them doing it, but suddenly I'm, you know, supporting them financially when it was never my intention to do that, and they're taking massive advantage. Yeah. Because I hadn't noticed the creep. Yeah. And so not noticing the creep and being genuinely quite easygoing and generous, and these things don't bother me. Yeah. And then, you know, someone asks you to drive 50 miles to pick them up and take them to the airport to save them a £10 taxi fare. And you suddenly go, hang on a minute, my time matters too. And you don't realize you've allowed the relationship to develop in that way. And then it seems like you've got to be really like snarky about it to say, hold on, there's a line here. And my previous experiences when I've done it, people have got angry that you're pulling the line. Instead of saying thank you for all that you've done these years, they say, what do you mean the gravy train stops here? It's like so those are some of the challenges I've experienced in setting and enforcing boundaries.
Thank you. And
I can go on, but let's hear from other people too.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of what you're talking about, and others were just talking about, was boundary predators. You know, you set a boundary, and then you get people that just show no respect for it. Yeah. And there was a fascinating Harvard article last year called "Set Better Boundaries." Yeah, and in there they said, you know, boundary predators rely on their power and authority, and your passivity. Yeah. To get away with it, which is exactly what you've just said, Janet. You know, people nibble away. Naomi, you're on mute, by the way.
My hand's still up from before. Sorry, I haven't taken it down. So, but
no worries, Celeste.
Yeah, I'm just adding on the conversation. I was thinking about the process of myself creating these boundaries. I can be very good at it, but sometimes I forget that others have their own. So we have 2 fences, right? Yeah. So how can we really leverage that and negotiate it and be clear about and get disagreement on the fence, only one fence? Yeah.
Yeah, which does require quite a high level, particularly of I would say conversational skill. Yeah. Particularly if you're doing it with somebody that has some sort of power in an organizational context or a family context. My mum doesn't like boundaries. She gets quite upset when I talk to her about when she can and can't phone, and gets quite angry about it and punishes me. So that is, I know if I'm going to set or enforce a boundary, it's going to require quite a lot of skill to be able to do that. Doreen, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about how some of you, especially when you are coaches or facilitators, deal with boundaries with friends who ask for consultation in a sense. And I remember during this period, a friend of mine lost his job, and he was a leader in an organization. He lost his job, and he took quite a bit of time, at least 6 months out in the market. So whenever he feels down, he didn't call his career coach, he called me. And then before he goes for an interview, and sometimes he called me, and I just, given his situation, I kind of allowed my boundary to be leaky and just to attend to him, because I know that he need a morale booster, that sort of stuff. And then when he found his job after about 6 months or so, and he liked to call me on his way home, and every time he called me, he started with, "How are you?" And I'll be like, something is up. And then there will be a leadership issue that he's looking at, my employee is not responding to call. I need engagement. And I kind of feel that my boundary was being kind of like invaded. But I realized I increasingly enforce my boundary when I realized that his emotional state is in a much better emotional state to take rejection. And the most recent encounter was because after calling me, on my dinner time, my preparation of dinner, and usually I rejected his call. And finally, one day I just got really frustrated. I just answered his call and say, I'm preparing dinner. You're on your way home, but I'm preparing dinner. And are you aware that, I need to prepare for dinner and cook? And then he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry. And then he stopped calling now at dinner time. But I think the challenge is where your friend asks you almost like for free service. I'm not too sure how do you guys manage that?
Rick, I see you've got your hand up. Did you want to answer that question?
I was actually no. I was actually saying I'm enjoying this conversation, and I'm curious. What do you, Matt, you and Tim, when you guys are working with a group, what are some of the things that you do to set up and to work with a group to have these discussions about setting boundaries? Just curious.
Yeah. So one of the things that I will talk about quite a lot with, certainly when I'm coaching leadership teams, is give and gets, which is effectively, let's set this conversation up for a negotiation, which is there's certain things that you want from people in this team, and there's certain things that they want from you. And so we kind of set it up for having a healthy conversation and negotiation, and kind of saying this is acceptable, this is okay. And in fact, it's not only okay, it's healthy. So that's one of the things that we will do. Anything you want to add, Tim?
Yeah, well, I just think, boundaries, there's always stuff to work on. You're never complete with this. It's always ongoing. It's always painful, but it's always worthwhile. And for me, a boundary's been violated because you feel it. When you consider that person, you see their name on an email list or on a Zoom chat, whatever it is, you have a certain feeling that's telling you something's going on. And if you're not attending to that, then something is not happening when it comes to boundary management. So, for me, it starts with how are you feeling about this particular relationship? There's always guidance there, and going into Matt's practical points work.
What I will also do as well, thanks, Tim, is particularly on an outside of work context, if people ask for help, I will often say to them that I've got lots of people I'm helping. I'm willing to give you this much. 3 hours. You use it how you want, but to extend it beyond that, there's going to have to be another conversation. But the initial gift that I'm giving to you is this much. And I find often people are quite comfortable with that, and then will use their 3 hours, 3 1-hour slots, however they use it, quite kind of carefully and respectfully. What I want to do is move on. Because
time boundary.
Because one of the things that is emerging from me from this conversation is a recognition that when people are doing this inside of an organizational context, there's a lot of dimensions and dynamics at play. And that's why what Tim and I have found painfully is if you're going to genuinely help people make a shift and not just run some mindfulness sessions or do a quick session on well-being, then, and this is the final piece I want to talk about, is you have to intervene with the system in mind. And if you just handle it on a very superficial or single issue basis, then in our experience, it tends to be pretty ineffective. And that's why the model that Tim took you through is like it is. It's holistic. It recognizes that we are in a system. And unless you think and act with the system in mind when you're making some sort of intervention, it is only going to be quite limited. Let me give you an example of that, where a team in a professional services firm planned an intervention with the system in mind, and let's have a look at the impact that it had. So this is EY. I mean, I mentioned I worked at KPMG. I mean, one of the most brutal times of year, if you've worked in a professional services firm, particularly an accounting firm, is, and I know Janet used to be an accountant, is busy season.
It is.
Because you've got a hard financial reporting deadline, and if you miss that for your clients, then all sorts of horrible things start happening. Now, there are exceptional circumstances, but it has to be genuinely exceptional, and it normally leads to a crash in share price. So it's definitely not the sort of thing that you as an accounting auditor want to be doing. So often what happens at the end of that busy season is you get a very high level of burnout, illness, sickness, people leaving. It's horrible. So EY, and you may have seen this particular experiment they did because it was published in Harvard back in 2018. They decided to carry out a system level experiment at the level of the team. And what they agreed was a number of practices that the entire team, including the audit partner, agreed to. So very simple practices, back to Tim's point, recharge practices and ways of working that can help. So number one was you get in the office and you spend the first 60 to 90 minutes focusing on the most important thing that you need to do. And you do that in an uninterrupted way. Second thing, at lunchtime, you move away from your desk for at least 30 minutes and have some sort of movement. Interesting, one of the guys we tested our model with, a leading health expert, his feedback to us when we showed him the model was, there's one thing that's missing from this. We said, what is it? He said, movement. He said, the lack of movement is the new smoking. And again, we've got research that shows the impact on your skeletal system of just failing to move frequently throughout the day. So it's interesting that they incorporated it. Thirdly, every 90 minutes that you've worked, you take a break for at least 5 minutes. Fourthly, when you finish work, you do some sort of transition to move from work to not work and to actually help with that. And then fifthly and finally, everyone agreed a pre-sleep routine. It's interesting that Tim's health guru talked to him about starting with sleep, because one of this team's practices was we all commit to getting at least 7 hours a night. And their hypothesis was, if we do this, will it lead to less health impact on us, and will it lead to better quality decisions? Because we're seeing the impact. I mean, in my old place, KPMG, I mean, they're just constantly being fined at the moment for poor audits. And you realize that level of pressure that auditors are under leads them to make poor decisions, to submit to organizational pressure. It's horrendous. Celeste, did you have a question or want to make a point at this juncture?
Yeah, I'm just curious to hear your input about if this experiment would really apply to this new context of people working online, remotely, hybrid.
Well, I think what's happening is people are agreeing different types of ground rules. So oftentimes what I'm doing with leadership teams I'm working with is we are talking about what sort of hypotheses do we have about ways of working that are going to help us in this context. And they're often coming up with different types of experiments and conditions.
Yeah.
So it's not these, it's different.
That's for me. Yeah. Thank you.
I guess a question you may be asking yourself is, okay, did it work? What was the impact of this experiment and this hypothesis? And this is a quote from the audit partner of this team, who said in the 5 months after busy season, and this was my experience, when accounting teams industry-wide often lose, multiple team members to exhaustion and burnout. I mean, with some teams, it was as high as 60% in KPMG. It was horrific. This team's retention stood at 97.5%. So I think the conclusion is it absolutely worked. Thinking and intervening with the system in mind. And we found, Tim and I found, that the team level is a very powerful level of the system to intervene at for actually creating that sense of agency to make something shift. So I know a lot of people talk about systemic, and what we're talking about is actually thinking through potentially all these different lenses. The individual, the team, the impact of the leader. Also, because let's face it, I'm sure we've all worked with teams where it's internal processes and structures and systems that are the source of so much energy depletion. And actually what needs to change is the system. But also, of course, the external context. I was coaching, in fact, peer coaching a bunch of people for a global 100 that last week that are, what this one guy was working at the HQ and was saying, I've got people in my team from Ukraine who are just, their anxiety levels are sky high. He said, I've got people in the same team, in the same office, the same physical office, who are Russian. They're full of shame and embarrassment. And not only that, a lot of them send money back to their families in Russia, and they can't now because they've been cut out of the global financial system. And he was just talking about how that context is having a huge impact. Question I'd be interested to ask you is what interventions have you found, particularly when it comes to kind of well-being and energy management, when you've intervened at a systemic level, have had the greatest impact? Before I show you what Tim and I have found has had the greatest impact.
Can you ask the question again? Can you?
Yeah. What types of intervention, or how have you intervened with this issue to have the greatest impact on people's health and well-being? Gordon, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, from my perspective, I think working with teams, the biggest thing I find, and it goes over to your emotion bit, is around meaning and control. So when I'm working with teams, it's around the goals, very much so, and getting people bought into those goals, making sure that those goals have meaning to them and that they have a level of control over their outcome. I think that has the biggest effect on resilience that I see.
Yeah. Thank you, Gordon. Janet?
The most effective for me has always been intervening with either the leader, the team leader, or someone in the team that everyone looks up to, and focusing on them role modeling it and little indications that what they believe in, sometimes, unnecessarily, but like literally walking out the door at an agreed time every day so that everyone can see them walk out the door when it's face-to-face work. But those little symbols, like the Nelson Mandela and the long trousers on Robben Island, a tiny thing that signals something bigger.
Yeah, nice.
And Matt, I'm just about to do a piece of work actually with a team in readiness for the new financial year, and part of the employment employee survey showed how work-life balance was the worst thing that came up on their team. in terms of resilience. And one of the things that he wants me to do with the team is to work on some boundaries, actually, around work-life balance. So this session's perfect, actually. It's a real trigger for me in terms of how I can create that systemic approach. But you're right, you know, if it doesn't come from the leader and it isn't a collective piece, then individuals on their own, I don't think can achieve an aspiration to improve that work-life balance within the team.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm just going to share with you 3 things, then I'll come back to you, Lucy, if you want to add anything, because I'm mindful of landing this on time and giving people the opportunity to react and question and challenge anything that we've said. I mean, 3 things we found, exactly as you guys have just been saying. We found that if you can mobilize as much of the system as possible, you increase your chances dramatically of actually bringing about change. So, for example, we worked with the CFO of a FTSE 200. His team was absolutely exhausted. They'd had people seriously ill, and he was actively engaged in the program. He made it explicit to everybody that the CEO was actively supportive. We've also found as well that engaging people over a period of time for as long as possible and holding them in that space of learning, as opposed to just a quick one-off intervention, has a significant kind of impact. We worked with the European leadership team of a global pharmaceutical, and we held them in this space of focusing on resilience and well-being as a leadership team for 6 months. And there were small things happening most weeks, very small things, micro content that we were sending to people that was just stimulating them. And that holding people and agreeing we're going to focus on this for a period of time started to change their team system much more than if we'd just done, say, a quick intervention, or even maybe a workshop for a couple of days over a year, 3 times, for instance. So that repeated intervention seemed to have made more of an impact. The other thing we found as well that makes a huge difference is actually getting small groups of peers to work together. And it's surprising the impact it has when people realize I'm not the only one struggling. In fact, we worked with a commercial leadership team in South Africa, and one group said we meet 8:00 a.m. Monday morning every week, and it's like a resilience check-in. And they said it is the most valuable meeting of the week because it reminds me I'm not alone in needing to fight to maintain boundaries and to keep working at my recharge practices. And without that, I know I would drift. And it gives me.
I just want to add to that, Matt. I mean, what I found is that everybody has a potential burnout story. It's amazing, literally everybody, right? And it's the easy way in to talk about depression as well. It's just literally a door opener, and it gets people straight away talking. So it's amazing just how everybody has one. They love sharing it. Yeah.
I was trying to share a document with you in chat, but I've realized I don't have permission. Maybe, Katie, you could enable us to have that permission so that we can share a doc. But I mean, just in drawing the formal bit to a close before we open it up, I mean, the theme of this whole conference, just linked to what Tim just said, is sustained success. And what we know is there is probably no time in history for teams and leaders when the risk of having a crash and burn is probably greater than it's ever been. And unless you take this seriously, I know Tim talks about the fact, a team has to have a recharge strategy, and if it doesn't, it is vulnerable. So that's the kind of, I guess, the big message is we all need it because the demands on us are so huge. I'm wondering if anybody's, we'd like to open it up just for the final 5 or 6 minutes. If anyone wants to react, ask questions, challenge, then we're open to that.
And Matt, I'm assuming you're talking about the document for Paula. You've noted that, have you?
Yeah, well, that particular slide with the research quote on it is in there, but I can't share it in chat, so I can't.
We're on it, Paula. So just to let you know.
Matt, I was just going to make a comment about the importance of assumptions here. Totally agree with what you just said just there about, you know, working in small teams, working over times, connecting peers. And I think actually the pandemic in some ways and the need to work virtually has actually made that easier. I can't think now of a team where I'm just doing a one-off intervention. Most of the interventions are over time with small groups. I sort of in these swim lanes of layers where you've got the sort of one-to-one stuff, the group stuff, the team stuff with touch points. So I think virtual's actually in this space positively has opened up a lot more possibility to do stuff in bite-sized chunks. So that was the first comment. Second comment was about the importance of assumptions. You asked about what is it that really helps. I think some of it is reframing those assumptions, the mindsets that people go into this with. I can't possibly stop myself from working this amount of time because of an assumption that it's expected. So one of the most powerful things with the team has been breaking down some of those unhelpful assumptions even before you start the work.
Brilliant. Thank you. Rob?
A point that really hit home with me was point 4 on one of your earlier slides, which I think I agree with everything Naomi just said. And I think one of the challenges in the virtual setup and this new psychological contract that people have of hybrid working or working from home is that separation from the work and home. And I sort of miss the commute, because I remember I used to drive, on my drive home, I used to literally visualize dumping a bag on a certain roundabout, which was all my work crap. And then I would leave that bag there, drive home, and I'll pick it up tomorrow morning on the way back. And sometimes it worked, most of the times it didn't. But it was a sort of a little ritual that I had that did help. And at work, where do you dump that bag? You know, because it's all around you all the time, you know, when you're now at home. And I think it's back to the boundaries conversation as well. But I think there's a real challenge there about getting that separation, which is, I think it's just an interesting change that we're dealing with both personally, but also I'm finding it with clients as well.
Rob, I'm a Londoner who now lives in Scandinavia, and my mates in London are going, you've no idea how much I miss the commute.
Yeah.
Seeing the value in just that transition, even though they used to moan about it. It's now, you know what, I won't moan about it anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Jen.
Did you say Jan or Tam?
I said Jen.
Jen, okay.
Hi everybody. Sorry, Janet, I'll only be a second. It was just on that comment, Rob, because I've said to all my clients to keep the commute, even when you're working from home, and to just make it a much more enjoyable one by going for a walk. But it's really helpful, I think, in terms of having those boundaries for beginning the day, ending the day. You know, what hat are you wearing? Is it your work hat or your home hat? But I think that's been a really useful thing to do, to keep the commute but make it more enjoyable and get out into nature before you start the day.
Yeah, it's a great one. The place that I'm struggling with it most is a team of volunteers in a volunteer organization where I'm the chair, and people get burned out because they care about what the organization's about and they're volunteering their time and they have real jobs. But when there's a crisis, the crisis needs handling. And so squeezing them for more time always feels like abusive, like I'm being a boundary predator. But, you know, we meet as a committee for 3 hours once a month. You can only get so much done in 3 hours once a month. And you know, some of them are older and virtual working is not easy for them. So I'm really struggling with how to help them have more balance and be able to bring more energy to the role we do and make it not so hard for everybody. That's probably where I'm struggling with it the most.
I get that, Janet. My wife works for a faith-based organization, and it's a massive issue because it's so values driven. Just to say, by the way, I've been able to upload the document into chat, which Tim and I wanted to share with you. Kate, this is probably the final question to finish on time, or comment.
It's a sort of observation, really. I've been working recently with people who are vulnerable through a range of issues, and that's actually been really helpful, because with some of those people who don't have the same operating system, people who are neurodiverse and what have you, they don't understand unless you are absolutely explicit. They will transgress boundaries just because they have no concept that the possibility of a boundary even exists. And that's been really helpful. And one of the things I've come to realize over working with them is that we are all vulnerable. It's in that way. We all have our own vulnerabilities. And so it's just an observation that I think maybe those explicit drawing of boundaries, those explicit conversations about boundaries are something that certainly I know I need to work on more with everyone, no matter who they are.
Hey, I just wanted to add to that. The more we care, the more we need boundaries, because typically when we care, we put so much more energy into something. And it really creates mayhem unless we kind of put some firm systems in place. And I know that from personal experience too. So you're really talking to me there.
Yes, thank you.
Tim, why don't you land the plane?
Can I make one comment before Tim lands the plane?
You wouldn't be Janet Jones without a final comment. Come on, Janet.
So my old business, 3 partners in that business, purpose-driven, huge vision for the world, huge vision for getting people connected. And I have been wrestling with cancer for like 12 years now. My other 2 business partners are both dead from cancer, one of whom was 10 years younger than me. And I believe that we ran a sick organization because we cared so much about the vision, we forgot to care for the people in the organization. Wow. Word of warning. Just a word of warning. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, I haven't got the final slides to take him through on the 4 things. Can you just fire it up?
Yeah, sure. There you go.
Yeah.
So folks, I mean, the one thing we didn't talk about was the diagnostic. We spent quite a long time building, how do you know where to focus on the model? So there's a free test. If you go to rechargeability.com, it's free, will be free for a long time. You can find out, so take it. You can also take it on your phone as well if you want to. So take the recharge test. Also, I think there's going to be a download, Matt. Have you already put the download in chat?
Yeah, it's in chat, so go ahead.
Yeah, so check out the download, which is going to capture a lot of kind of today's information in chat, and there's lots of stuff you can use as well. We've been building the last few months our website, rechargeability.com. We're now putting a podcast on every single part of the model. So we've got the next 6 months. I think we've done the first 8 now. So every week we're putting up podcasts going into a bit more flavor on the model. So please, if you're interested, you can share those, look at those. They just kind of put a lot of kind of research and thinking behind the depth that we've kind of tried to access. And of course, we'd love you to buy the book, but you don't need to buy the book, but we'd love you to buy the book. So we invite you to try it out and share it. So yeah, that's what we're happy to share today, folks. And any more questions, we'll let you go. We'll honor your time boundary as well.
Thanks very much for all your lovely sharing, folks. See you later. Bye-bye.